Welcome back to the Health, Safety, and Wellness session. I'm Willie Jones, Director of Health, Safety, and Wellness for OECB. This is a hybrid session. So one of the things that, to help the folks who are online, we'll always use the microphones for any questions so they can also hear what's going on. So with that, we're going to turn it over to our friends from Tarrytown Pharmacy, Deb Maloy and AJ, yes, and AJ. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Was that a little loud? And keep you all awake after you had your lunch? Okay. So good afternoon. I'm Deb Maloy. I am a registered nurse. I'm also a certified developmental disabilities nurse. I have been in the field in the provider world for about 28 years. And about 4 years ago, I decided I wanted to make a change. And I joined Tarrytown Expo Care Pharmacy. Tarrytown is unique that we only provide services to IDD agencies in behavioral health. So come and see us at our table. You're also going to see DDNA president. DDNA is Developmental Disabilities Nurses Association. It's a national association supporting DD nurses. I'm the current president and have been on the board for about 9 years. So great opportunity. You do not have to be a nurse to be a member. It's a great support for DD nurses. We hold an annual educational conference, periodic webinars, and so forth. And you can also get a certification as an RN or a certification as an LPN as a DD nurse. So it's a feather in your cap for you folks as well. With me today is my cohort, AJ, and I will let AJ introduce himself.
Hello, everybody. I'm AJ Forster. I'm one of the regional directors for Tarrytown. The majority of my career has actually been from the provider standpoint. I was an ICF director and community living arrangement director for the previous 10 years, as well as studied ABA and worked with behavioral health agencies throughout Pennsylvania. Really, a lot of that knowledge that we've built into this presentation is from those settings with CMS final rule, and just really important information that we felt everybody would benefit from with the national guidelines on how to prepare for an emergency. I'm also super jealous that Deb has so many initials and titles after her name. I realized AJ's already a short name, but when I looked at the PowerPoint, I didn't realize that she was outclassing me there. So I'll have to step it up over the next couple of years.
I do have some age on you. Okay, so as a part of the nursing CEs, just a quick note, we have to review the outcome. So the goal is the nurse's scope of practice will be enhanced by the ability to identify the emergency preparedness needs of medication management in an emergent situation. And at that point, I'm going to hand it back over to AJ.
Cool. So when we're talking about emergency preparedness, we're talking about the final rule that came into place after things like Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina happened in 2001, although like many emergencies, it does seem like it was way more frequently. But really, CMS put out rules and guidelines in place after that emergency because obviously they were very understaffed. They didn't have a big plan in place for any type of evacuation. Even though with Hurricane Katrina, a lot of those circumstances were foreseeable. So you would have thought that agencies would have taken it upon themselves to be prepared for an emergency. So at that point, CMS put some rules in place in 2001 to be able to plan for emergencies. Providers were given a broad range of events, including natural, man-made, and facility emergencies. If we were in the hallway today, we would probably be evacuating the premises. If we lived here, if we were an IDD group home, anything typically under 64 degrees, if you're going to have to be there overnight, you're going to be evacuating that program. So events like that, we're expected to have things in place. And I'm sure the Hilton has some things in place that they're jumping to as well. Most programs, what was required is to be able to do a hazards approach, identifying hazards and developing capabilities that can address a wide range of events. I'm sure Northeast Ohio receiving 40 inches of snow is well aware of what what events are going to transpire in winter. They would be expected to have some things in place to be able to address things like cold weather, evacuation, maybe backup generators, things like that. But really a broad range of anything that would happen in that specific geographical area. They do two main things in the risk assessment. It's the community-based risk assessment, which is a specific geographical location. I would expect, like I said, Northeast Ohio to have power outages would be the number one thing that would occur. You would have your snowfall, temperatures, things, all those would be your top risk categories. I know that there's also tornadoes and other events that take place in Ohio, which would all be qualifying events. And then you would do a facility-based risk assessment that would identify specific things such as staffing. When I was in Pennsylvania, we would have a staffing event every year that would require about 80% of our staff would want to attend this specific Liberian National Day. For that specific program that operates with 80 to 90% of its residents being from Africa, English as a third language, that qualified as a facility-based risk assessment because 80% of our staff are trying to take off for that specific weekend every year that I had never heard about prior to working there. But on that first call out day, I quickly realized that we need to plan for this every year that I'm here moving forward. Medications shortage would be another one. It's nice working at Tarrytown with 10 pharmacies across the country where we're able to pull meds from location to location. But specific geographical areas do have shortages at different periods of time. New Jersey had a shortage on albuterol inhalers that only really impacted New Jersey during that specific summer. We were able to navigate that with the pharmacy by pulling our resources together, but that was very specific to just that northern part of New Jersey. For whatever reason, the albuterol wasn't reaching North New Jersey. Other things might be like a cyber attack. Something that would specifically happen. One just occurred recently with FedEx that impacted many providers and impacted many pharmacies and impacted shipping around the country. Luckily, it was short-lived, but all of those would be qualifying facility-based. Something in Philadelphia that happened that I never would have guessed when I first started working there was the Pope. You know, the Pope came to town, and we were extremely excited to have the Pope in town in Philadelphia. Then we did a search location on what all of our employees' addresses were. It turns out that 85% of those individuals approximately were inside the green box that you see on the screen. All of the staff that worked at that area lived inside the area of Philadelphia. Yay, the Pope's in town. I actually worked with a group that got to ring the joy bells, and we actually opened up for the ceremony. But when it comes to planning, and 80% of your staff are within this square box of area that you're not physically allowed to leave during the time that he's in town, you really have to, brace for impact and come up with some plans quick of how you're going to navigate that. I had no idea really that, we were just kind of excited that the Pope was going to come to town. I didn't realize a vast amount of work that would take. When you see Northeast Ohio and you're getting 40 inches of snow, you know what to do, right? But when the Pope's coming to town, you're kind of hoping to be able to celebrate. You don't really think about all those other events that it's going to trigger. For us, it had road closures. That green area that I showed you was essentially a Pope barrier. The hospitals that we normally navigated those residents to, if there was an emergency, were also inaccessible or delayed. So we knew that turnaround time to be able to get to those hospitals would be delayed or potentially inaccessible altogether. Community outings were all canceled for all the residents, which created other issues. In Pennsylvania, there's certain community outings that you're required to go on, and a certain amount of time is supposed to be spent in the community. I'm sure the same is true in Ohio, but they were all canceled. So that also triggered some behavioral events, right? So if the individuals are all expecting to go somewhere, they're very strict on what their schedule should be, where they're going, what they're doing with their day. You throw the wrench in place now that, your day program is most likely closed due to staffing. We're going to staff you at the home. You're also not going to be able to go on the community outings that you were expecting to go on. Any type of medical appointments that also would have taken place at the same time, we rescheduled those so that we wouldn't have to pull more staff to travel with those residents. And on top of that, that was just all for the program. What happened was they closed all the schools. So most of those individuals that worked inside that green box are also parents. that they were expecting their individuals, their family members to go to school, but now they're also scrambling for things like babysitting or some sort of daycare throughout the course of the day. So that obviously increases call outs as well. So yes, it was exciting to see the Pope Mobile rolling through town, and it was, you know, there was some fun aspects to that. But at the end of the day, it was more aggressive really than any fire evacuation or snow event that I had experienced prior to that. And it really kind of opened my eyes to what should we be doing in the future for any type of emergency event, foreseeable or unforeseeable. You know, you could see things like snow, you could see things like, you know, thunderstorms coming and things of that nature. But when it comes down to things like cyber attacks or, you know, the Pope Mobile, they're a little bit more difficult to navigate. And sometimes you don't even know what you're navigating at the time. You know, some of that was after the fact. You know, we learned a lot from that specific event that we would carry forward in the future. So I do have a lot of Philadelphia references in here. So what no, Ohio did just beat us down again in football. So it's a sad day. So practice really does make perfect for anybody that does fire drills, and every program knows, like, if you don't run a fire drill for a period of time, then it obviously gets more sloppy. Fire drills I referred to a couple times just because that's the one event everybody is regularly required to do from a regulation standpoint and from a frequency standpoint. So they require a couple of those. One is a full-scale community-based exercise, what they call boots on the ground. It typically involves multiple agencies and disciplines performing the functions that they would in a natural emergency. Really the most complicated, and the general guidelines for there from CMS are that you are required to physically engage the community. The community would not be physically required to engage with you. So at the very least, you would be writing certified letters to everybody in the community to request them to be able to participate in your exercise, and you'd be keeping that in your emergency preparedness binder for your annual review. Facility-based exercises are more frequent and more common because you're in full control. You know, you're the administrator of the program. You're the one that's going to be exercising. Everybody that is either working there or living there would be required to do it. And it's a lot easier if you're the boss and you're able to perform those tasks and require that of everybody. That's an exercise on the emergency plan to address that specific hazard. So if we were in the hallway, we would say, somebody, and I've done this many times, I'm in the home and I'm watching the temperature go from 67 to 66, and I'm waiting for somebody from facilities to come and check the boiler. I'm hoping they come. Now it's 64, hit 63. Oh, now we're moving out. So in that meantime, we would be packing everybody's things and finding another home that we might be able to relocate to. We also had a gymnasium on that campus that could be set up for temporary housing. So if we were going to do a facility-based exercise there, a real event would actually qualify. So me actually evacuating that house, if I were to complete the paperwork associated with that, take the learning that I took from that and be able to share it with the group, get feedback from the DSPs, the individuals, the managers that took place, that would be considered a facility-based exercise, whether it was a real event or whether it was a practice event. Then you could do a tabletop exercise, which is the most common because you don't actually have to do anything. You would sit around a table and you would do the exercise. What would we actually do in the case that the boiler went? What steps would we have to take? Then things like clothing, housing. How do you find where there's a vacancy in your program that you'd be able to have a resident move into? Maybe you would look at different peer groups. If two residents did get along, that might be able to cohabitate for the night. Also finding residents that wouldn't potentially be able to live together would be something that you would be looking into. Clothing, how you would actually be able to navigate that if there was poor weather, things like that. You would then write all that down, kind of go through the pros and cons of all that, document any efforts that you've made, any learnings, whether they be good or bad, and then that'll qualify you for a tabletop exercise. There's really 4 core elements that come into any type of emergency preparing. So you have risk assessment and planning. That portion would then roll into your policies and your procedures. Then how are you going to communicate that, not just with the other employees, but annually, how are you going to communicate that with your employees, your governing body, the families of your residents, and the individuals themselves, and then your requirements for training and testing those plans. So element one, risk assessment and planning. Do you want to do this? That's not quite meds yet. So element one, risk assessment and planning, has community-based hazards and then facility-based hazards, which I mentioned before. What would be typical here? It doesn't seem like heat and humidity would quite hit the scale in this month, but a severe thunderstorm is very likely in Ohio, just like Pennsylvania. Blizzards, way more likely in Ohio than they are in Pennsylvania. Obviously, you've already gotten 40 inches of snow. We barely even scratched the surface on some dew on the grass. The epidemic is always going to be on the list now after COVID. And then the most likely things that would happen during a facility based are your electrical failure. If you have a generator, great, but they also fail. So there's a lot of requirements around training and testing those. Plumbing and floods are very common as well. Plumbing issues that would require you to be able to evacuate. And then a communication failure, whether that be some sort of digital, however you're moving forward with your communication, if that's Blackboard or if that's an email blast or, you're using telephones or there's text message features that can go out to the group. They do frequently fail. In terms of a power outage, you have the physical plant, which you'd be looking at, which I mentioned before, with your certain ranges of your temperature that would be required for the program. Then you're also going to be planning for resident care. What are your staffing ratios? What is the level of care needed for each individual? Have they been trained on your ISP, your BSP, your EPP, or really anything else with initials, it appears? So you want to make sure that the staff that you're using, whether in the new location, are trained on the minimum requirements for that resident, but they also know who they're working with and they've been trained on, the best case and the worst case scenarios of the shift. The staffing needs are always a big one because, you have your minimum ratios that would be required for safety. So you always want to make sure that you're maintaining your minimum ratio, but then you also want to have the ratio that would meet their active treatment goals, keep people busy, keep them happy, and keep them doing something while they're, being shuffled around in this scenario. And then you have your medication, which is a huge deal because you have so many meds that need to be given in such a brief period of time. If you're doing medication and you're moving residents into a new location, I'd be looking at things like, well, how many meds are actually being provided in the home? The average across America is 15 medications per individual with IDD. It would be very complicated. We do something called a quarterly business review where we review residents' profiles. We had one resident that was taking 34 medications on the second shift. If I was looking to move somebody else that was taking 22 medications, I might not pick that home. You have an hour before and after your med pass time to be able to complete that, your med pass. So you're looking at things like how many meds can we physically provide during this 2-hour period. There's also storage of those medications. You're locking, double locking. You have HIPAA as well that would be involved with the portability of all that information. So medication is really in depth. You want to do that one, right?
Swap. Okay, so the next section that we're going to go into is talking a little bit more specifically in regards to medications. And as AJ hit on some of these, when we're in an emergent situation, we still have to deal with the medication administration and the process, following policy and procedure and all those things just like we normally would. So obviously we have the 6 rights of medication administration. That still needs to be followed. That's a safety measure. Here in Ohio, we have the video of the young gentleman that died as a result of a medication error. Alex's story, if you've not seen it, it is to be used in all the medication administration training programs with that. And as I tell people when I teach the course, I am positive that staff did not go to work that day thinking that they were going to kill somebody, but they did. And that's because the 6 rights of medication administration, somewhere along the line, something went wrong, and it went really wrong. The other thing, just kind of a quick note or a side note with that is, if our DSPs have a lot of responsibilities. And if I forget to show somebody how to brush their hair that day or brush their teeth or tie their shoe, it's not the end of the world. But there are three things that can kill our individuals, and that's allergies, medications, and diets. So those things in particular really need to be paid attention to. Medications, we talk about all forms. So we need to consider, how are we managing those meds that need to be refrigerated? Okay. Now, obviously this time of year, not so much of an issue, but in the summer, it's going to be an issue. How do I keep those refrigerated meds cold? Okay. Adaptive equipment. Is there adaptive equipment that needs to be utilized? Is that being taken with us when we're moving off site somewhere else in an emergent situation? Is there a self-administration goal? Are we still working on that aspect of that? We want to try and keep things as normal as possible for our individuals anyways. And quite honestly, I have said, and I started out my career over 30 years ago in a 54-bed ICF. And I always said that our individuals did better about adapting to things than our staff did. So those are things that we do need to pay attention to. Those things we want to be as consistent as possible. Spoons. Are there particular spoons? Are there measuring spoons? And I'm not talking about your teaspoon, tablespoon. I'm talking about the spoon that we're using for a specific increment for individuals. Is there a need for thickened liquids? Do we have the thickener? Is there pudding? Is there applesauce? Are there items available that are ready to go when we need an emergency evacuation? Sippy cups, medication cups, any specialized cups that are being used with individuals. It might be a nosy cup, whatever type of thing that is that we're using. Is that readily available? Are we collecting those things? You know, I tend to be a person that had checklists of things. And so in that type of a situation, I might put on a med cart, a checklist of things in an emergency situation that I've got to make sure I'm grabbing these things. I've got to make sure I've got them. Are they in the med cart? Are they where the meds are stored? Because I also realize that not everybody has med carts. I don't have one in my house that I pass meds from. So, and how do they take their meds? Are there specifics? And again, that kind of goes back to storage and all those pieces and parts of that. Is there water? And usually there's an evacuation that you're doing. There's a backup supply of so many days of food and water anyways, but we need to make sure, is there additional water for med passes as well? Paper towels, napkins, wet ones, any of those type of things that we've got available. And those aren't necessarily things that you think about in the midst of it. You got to think about those things in advance and have those supplies available. Obviously the medication administration record, because just because we're in an emergent situation doesn't mean that you don't document it. You still have to follow the same processes. And I hope you brought a pen. So pens always come up missing, don't they? I don't know where they ever go to. It's kind of like the side effect drug fact sheets that you have in the house when you go back and it's like, I just took a whole batch of those last week. Where'd they go to? So I can't blame it on the dog because there's no dog there. So do we have enough medication and staff to administer the medications? Are we managing those pieces and parts? How long is the emergency expected to last? Some of those we might be able to tell. Northeast Ohio, they might have thought that they were getting a little beyond that, and now they're back on an emergency level 3 in Ashtabula County again. So who knows? You never know. You might be able to best plan, but sometimes your plans might need to be extended a little longer than what you anticipated. Do we have enough of those provisions for how long that period of time is going to be as well? At what point will evacuation be required? So are there things that we're doing in place in Northeast Ohio, which I worked there for 23 years? We also had the nuclear power plants that we had to deal with, and you had evacuation plans that we had to go through annually as well in regards to that, and whether you were in place or, shelter in place, or whether you had to evacuate off premises. What activities can the individuals engage in? Obviously, things are going to be hectic. Things are going to be crazy. We want to try and keep things as minimal as possible, with changes. But obviously, if you're evacuating to another place, what are some things that you have that you can take with you to help engage those individuals as well? Will staff be required to sleep on site? For how long? What's provisions for them? Replacements? All those type of things. And what do we do in an emergency, a medical emergency? How is that being handled? Okay. What's your backup plan? What's the situation? Where's the closest place I can go to? Who can I call for assistance? In addition to the training with this, a paper MAR or an EMAR, and you need to look at that if it's an electricity issue. I don't remember what year it was, 2002-ish, maybe, that we had the blackout in Northeast Ohio that went from Ohio to Pennsylvania to New York. How many of you remember that? Yeah. So, your electronic MAR, is there a backup? If internet is out, electricity, some of those are set up that you can log it and then it will update when you get reconnected. But those are things to kind of look at, consider. Obviously, your paper MARs from that standpoint, it's a little easier to pick up your MAR book and take it with you. Privacy screen, the ability to provide some privacy when you're administering medications as that need arises. And that might be a little bit more challenging. But a lot of times, if you have an evacuation, you're going to know where you're going to be evacuating to. And those would be things to think about when you're doing that preparation for that ahead of time. Getting there and then thinking about it isn't the best time to have thought through that process to figure out, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this? The medications we talked about as far as with applesauce, pudding, thickener. Do we have the things that we need for medication as well as liquid consistency and be able to manage those? A lot of those items you might be able to maintain in a med cart, but like I said, in a lot of cases in the group home supported living, and there's an evacuation of an area, where are you going to for that? But also you don't have med carts that you can just throw everything into and go. And quite honestly, those med carts aren't going to be real easy to pick up and stick in your car. So looking at those type of things and considering what's the backup plan. How am I going to get that information there? How am I going to get materials there that I need to the location I need to go to? Again, refrigerated medications, certainly any eating precautions with food. And again, choking being one of the things that I can unfortunately kill somebody over. So we do want to make sure that we are managing that appropriately. And then obviously the health record and maintaining that, documenting. And believe me, I completely understand it's going to be crazy. It's going to be hectic. Those are things that you may not necessarily think about, but those are things that do need to occur as well. So when we talk about refrigerated medications, any meds that need to be kept cold need to be kept cold for a reason. Okay. When that changes, if they need to be refrigerated and they're not, and they're left out for a period of time, that composition of that medication changes and it's not going to be effective or not as effective. Okay. So even those antibiotics that are to be refrigerated and you go in, somebody left the house at 8 o'clock this morning, somebody's back in the home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they see the antibiotic sitting out on the counter. That doesn't mean you stick it back in the refrigerator and use it. That means you should be contacting your pharmacy and asking and saying, hey, I just came on site. This medication's been left out. What do I need to do? Okay, get some help, get some guidance, ask questions. Typically 12 to 24 hours, refrigerators and freezers generally maintain a pretty constant temperature. Again, that's also going to go back to how many times is that refrigerator door opened. I don't know about you guys, but I remember when our electricity would go out, every time one of us kids opened the refrigerator, mom was yelling at us, shut the door. So it's like, okay. AJ, I'm going to let you talk about this because you might have had some experience with it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, it's not quite as cold in Pennsylvania, but We did come up with some options there. So what we'd found when we were evacuating was like a portable cooler that we'd be able to use solar power to be able to continue keeping the medication cold. Obviously, there's some barriers there. If you have, there's a financial barrier. It wasn't the cheapest cooler I could have found in the world, that's for sure. If you have a thunderstorm and or it's at nighttime and you're installing all this, obviously you have another barrier with, you don't have the sunshine not out. But they do work in the winter and they do work in a variety of atmospheres. I've used them. The nice part with those is we also had walkie-talkies that we needed to charge that were able to pick up power. We had phones and they have charging capabilities, and it was able to charge things for, I think, 12 to 18 hours. We were able to get some charges on our other equipment. But there are obviously some pros and cons with any piece of installation. With ICFs, it would be considered a foreseeable cost. So that cooler would have qualified. It seems weird to purchase a cooler that's over $500. But it did qualify as a foreseeable event, a foreseeable purchase. So we were able to get reimbursed for that, the cost of that equipment, because it's required in an ICF to be prepared for the emergency. So they have things in place to be able to get reimbursed for those needs. Mobilization was always the most difficult part. And like Deb said, sometimes it's more difficult to mobilize to the staff than it is to the actual residents. But even during that time, and this is a little repetitive, we still have to store the medications appropriately. Privacy does not go away in an emergency. I remember that during the pandemic, a lot of things changed and you would have thought there would have been more leniency. But privacy never goes away. If you're in somebody's bedroom and you're getting somebody changed, obviously you have a screen. If you're giving somebody their medications, you're going to be screening that off. It's not appropriate to be giving somebody medications and somebody else watching that whole process. It's a privacy issue. The supplies to medicate, Deb just talked about that task analysis that I created, but there's so many steps, 15, 20 things you need just to be able to provide one medication. During a tabletop activity, I think it's the best time to figure out what it would actually be that you're going to be using for this med pass at a table with a group of professionals that do it every day. And then it's super fun to forget like the 5 things that were so obvious that you needed during the med pass. When you actually physically go and watch one, you realize that there was a lot more to this process than you ever would have thought. The MAR is great. You need to be able to document any administration. That requirement also doesn't go away. Tarrytown is nice. We have pre-populated MARs with the days that you're going to administer medications are left open. They're on paper. So you're able to just, if I were a program and using Tarrytown, I would take those every month when my cycle came and I would put them in my emergency preparedness folder that I would be using to evacuate. Adaptive equipment, it's prescribed, right? So a physician has prescribed this for a specific need. That doesn't mean that during your new needs in this new location, now you're now allowed to omit that. Unless you were somewhere somehow documented that probably within your ISP, that there's certain things that you would use and not use at different periods of time. So it is nice to build some things in to your ISP for different circumstances, but you need that adaptive equipment. If somebody's going to be using a hand splint and a spoon to be able to feed themselves at dinner, you want them to be able to do that regardless of if it's the same environment or a new environment. That's how they feed themselves, that level of independence. And then I use the acronym earlier, EPP, your eating precaution plan, obviously needs to travel because everybody needs to know the liquid consistency, the food consistency, the rate of eating. Sometimes they have cyclical ingestion. All those things should be listed on your eating precaution plan, which I do get confused sometimes because it's also an emergency preparedness plan, which is both EPP, which is fun. But all things that you would need, all things that would need to be trained for your staff, and all things that are super important for the individual's safety as well as independence. So it's an emergency. Do we still need to have secure medication and health records? You would think that there would be some leniency when it comes to these things, that you're dealing with this incredible, difficult situation in which you've just pulled everybody out of their house and you're going to a new location. So there has to be some leniency there. No, there is not. So your medications and your health records still need to be secure. And all the policies that you've already created for your agency are still in place, regardless of it's an emergency or not. They're hoping that you have the foresight to be able to manage these situations appropriately and still give the individuals everything that they need to be successful. What would be some things that could do that for you? A locked room, a cabinet, a filing cabinet, a locked case would suffice. That cooler could have a lock on it. A lot of people use bank bags that have a key on it for their double secured medications, but any of those would be appropriate. I'm not aware of any states that dictate a specific type of equipment that would be required. Really, the regulation is a single or double lock depending on the med. Element 2 is your policies and your procedures. So your emergency preparedness plan should indicate what policies would be impacted. So it's an easy one to say your emergency and preparedness policy, but maybe your use of volunteers would be a good example to talk about. If you have individuals that are highly aggressive at your agency and you're evacuating them in the community, and now you're going to be requiring community people to be engaging with those residents, is that something that your agency would be okay with, or is that something that you would not prefer? We would be able to, at the program I was at, we'd be able to evacuate to a local high school that was closed on weekends. So we wouldn't actually require any volunteers. We actually decided not to use volunteers because the individuals we had aggressive individuals. We also had, most of our individuals had cerebral palsy or osteoporosis. So they were extremely fragile for any lifts or transfers. So we actually decided not to use volunteers at all, which we wrote into our plan, unless it was actually specifically emergency personnel, firemen, policemen, nurses, etc. And then if you're going to make any edits during your tabletop activity or any of your facility-based activities, what policy or your emergency codes would be impacted? So where I was, we had walkie-talkies where we would call a specific code to be able to say, there's an emergency at the nurses station. What type of emergency would that be? It was a code 6 would be a behavioral crisis. If we were going to relocate to the Hilton and now we don't have our walkie-talkies and we don't have all those devices, how are we going to notify each other when we're in the community that we're going to need each other's assistance? So we would specifically outline that in our policies so that when the event did come, everybody was already aware and trained annually on what those requirements would be. Your evacuation policy would obviously, in that example I gave before, we would want to know the parameters that would outline under what circumstances we would evacuate. Typically, your regulations for your state would already indicate that. And then we would let the family members know and the staff know those parameters as well, so that when they get called about the relocation, there's no surprise. They've already been trained on it annually. Everybody's already aware of the situation that's going to occur and what the parameters were. But it is always nice to reference that policy within your emergency preparedness plan. In addition to the other two, your extreme weather and your actual medication emergency policy. Element 3 is your actual communication. What does that actually look like? There are certain groups of people that are required to be communicated with. Obviously, the individual themselves that would be in your care would need to be aware of your emergency plan. But in addition to that, the family or the guardian would also need to be made aware and signed annually that they're aware of these requirements. Every employee, typically in their annual in-service, would go through the similar training and receive the similar information, and they would sign off annually that they're aware of these parameters and what we have in place for any emergency. Any contractors, such as the pharmacy, like if I were now, I didn't work at Tarrytown then, but that pharmacy that we were now relocating to the Hilton, I would want them to make sure that they knew about where we were going to relocate. If we're going to send a courier to your campus to be able to deliver your meds, and that is no longer a possibility now, that's one of those boxes that you want to check to make sure that we are in fact able to navigate to the new location. What time would we actually arrive? Maybe that's further away than it would be typically. What other things would need to take place if you're at the Hilton and now we're going to a front desk and speaking to somebody at the hotel rather than, your front desk, your receptionist? Obviously, a lot of things change. We would need access to your individual's information. If I had a delivery for Deb, I wouldn't be able to just go to the front desk and say, well, what room is Deb Maloy in? Obviously, they would shoot that question down and say that they're not allowed to give me that information. So that's a nice, important step, something that people don't typically think about when you're doing your tabletop. That we can't just walk in and just ask for so-and-so. And then how are we going to do all of that, right? You have an emergencies going on. We served about 170 individuals. If we're going to evacuate that campus, all of our managerial staff are now going to be on the telephone calling every individual family to notify them of this. while they're also packing up all their equipment and relocating everybody. So what is your means of communication? What would be appropriate? A lot of schools and a lot of programs in Pennsylvania use like a Blackboard message, which you could just email blast out everybody that has provided their email address or their phone number. So at one click of a button, you're able to give one message to everybody at the same time and then create those feedback loops, and the communication's clear. Here's who you contact in case you have any questions about, what emergency we're currently experiencing. All of that should be listed inside of your emergency preparedness plan. If you're using telephones, if you're using walkie-talkies, we also purchase satellite phones. Just, I don't know with what's it called, Starlink now with Elon, but there's a lot of different features in which now you can actually have Wi-Fi. Your ability to make a phone call during a power outage has been increased with, technology. Like I said, email blasts also work, and your Blackboard messages are the common ways that people do this. So element 4 is testing and training. So really you have to be able to demonstrate completing 2 facility related exercises per year. The plan itself must be updated annually, and effort should be made to reach out to as many community groups as possible. So there's a couple parts there. When I say that your plan needs to be updated annually, any of those tabletop activities that I just mentioned would qualify. If you learned anything from any of those, that would qualify for any revision. So if you had evacuated to the Hilton and the pharmacy came up to deliver your meds and they said, oh, sorry, we can't give you that residence room, that would be a piece of learning that you would now update in your emergency preparedness plan. Your name and date would go on top of that plan to say that we've made a revision. This was the learning that took place, and that would qualify as your annual revision. Your name and date. When I said, I already mentioned it earlier, but communities aren't required to engage with you. They have all their own sets of regulations. So what we did was we found other people in the area that were in a similar situation, other providers that had the same equipment, same type of grounds, similar training, similar staff. Are there places that we'd be able to go down the road that is another group home that would have similar resources, and we could all kind of check these boxes together, right? So the company I work for had I would call it a sister organization. We contacted them. They obviously needed to check all the same boxes as we did. They were in a different geographical area, so they potentially wouldn't be impacted by the same event. And then we all got to work together to be able to make sure that we checked all these boxes and kept everybody safe. It's a win-win. They're required to do it. We're required to do it. That really worked well. Other than that, people like the Hilton or hotels, other homes, Airbnb, whatever you're thinking about moving these residents into, they have no requirement to be able to work with you, and they might want to avoid it altogether. So what we did was we had certified mail. We reached out to, I think, 30, 35 different providers or agencies, hotels, different people from around that community. We documented our efforts. 0 for 30, I would say we went. Nobody was really jumping on board for that one. But eventually we did find a local high school that was willing to work with us, as well as that sister agency, and that checked the boxes that were needed to be required for our emergency preparedness plan. So testing should be based on your community-based risk assessment. If you're going to assess this area, you're going to come up with maybe the 5 to 10 most likely scenarios that would happen. You would want to take the most likely, and that would be the first thing that you would target. And then that would be how you would probably sit down and do a tabletop. And then you would work your way up to a facility-based exercise and potentially a community-based exercise if appropriate. They should be done twice a year and held to the minimum standard of your own facility. Any learning should be added to your EPP binder, and that qualifies as an emergency event. When I say the minimum standard, it does sometimes change. So we had different facilities that had to evacuate in 2 minutes and 30 seconds for a fire evacuation, but that was our own internal policy. We had a fire marshal that said that under 4 minutes would be appropriate. You're always held to your own policy as well as the standard. So if there's a regulatory issue or a regulatory, you have to meet your regulatory requirement, but if your facility has a requirement that is more intrusive, like 2 minutes and 30 seconds rather than 4 minutes, you would be held to your 230. And then you want to utilize the community as much as possible. And as I said, document your attempts. So if we had a storm, if we had a storm and damage the roadways in your 24/7 facility, your generator fails, you have no power in your building, how would you address the 4 elements? You would do a facility-based example with your medications. What are some things that you'd be doing? You'd be relocating, relocation due to the extended power outage. You're going to physically demonstrate some things. You're actually going to physically watch them demonstrate how your facility will relocate those individuals. I would suggest doing it at your minimum ratio to see if that's possible, because your minimum ratio is most likely what you're going to experience. I know when I did a lot of fire evacuations, it was always with like our max capacity of staff. If we never really did it at our minimum ratio, but especially in like a snowstorm where it's already going to be difficult for people to come, you would want to do it at your minimum ratio if possible. Demonstrate how they're going to pack and store the medications in a safe fashion and double lock it. When you physically watch somebody do these tasks, you do pop up a lot more questions than when you kind of think about it in your head. So you would want to physically do that. And if you have a behavior analyst or anybody that does ABA, or you would create like a task analysis of what that process actually look like. You're going to demonstrate how you're going to give those medications and maintain privacy. I know that we did one at a hotel. It was nice. We had a room. It locked. It was great. We had a nurse. We would have a single room that they would walk into at the hotel and pass medications. They had a refrigerator. The nurse left the room. She walked down the hallway to get one of the residents. The door locked. Keys are inside. You know, now we can't even get into the room anymore that we made so secure to be able to pass the medications. So a learning example that you might want to have a couple sets of keys or administrators that have access. Yeah, no, and then that I wouldn't write that one down necessarily on my revision, although it would qualify. I don't know if I would want to embarrass myself and put down that I forgot my key card, but it would still qualify. And then how do you document your administration? You know, make sure you actually go through the documentation process. When you're at a nursing station or you're at the same place where you pass meds every day, you have a routine and everything's where it needs to be. But I would document the length of time it took me to do this in the hotel room rather than doing it at my own nurse station. If you're capable of passing your medications on a second shift, you know, you have a 4 o'clock med pass every shift, you're fine doing that from 3 to 5. That makes sense. Now you go to a hotel and you try to do the same exact thing. I guarantee it takes longer than it did at your normal location. And then will your pharmacy participate? So that would be considered, you know, a facility-based exercise. You would be able to have your pharmacy re-navigate those medications. If you had called us and said, we're going to test this, Tarrytown would participate. We would actually send your medications with a courier to the new location, or we do an overnight delivery as well. We would actually document our capabilities and any things that we wouldn't be able to participate in. We would use that then to improve our own services at Tarrytown, but we would also make sure that we're able to meet your minimum needs, but also make you happy during the process. And that would qualify you for either a tabletop activity or a facility-based activity if you were to participate with a member like your pharmacy. The main thing that they want is for you to capture any feedback loops. You know, it's not really, you know, the event's going down and you're going to do everything you can to make sure that everybody's safe. But the next time, if there was something that went poorly, the next time you should have a plan in place for that, right? So you have your 2-hour med pass. It took you 2 hours and 15 minutes. You know, now you have an issue on your hands. The next time, what are the couple things that we might do differently to get them back that 15 minutes? They really want to see that you've taken the feedback seriously and worked it back into the plan for those revisions. So you want to document your successes and document any barrier to your success. Every success and failure is a way to further refine your plan so that you can have better success during a real event. And then if you do make any revisions, you would once again write your name down and put the date on that revision. And then you would also change anything with your plan and your policies if they were impacted. I always had a refer to policy on my emergency preparedness plan. So in case my policy changed and it was still policy 101, that policy changed. That way in my plan, it just referred to the actual policy number rather than the entire policy. That way the change was there. You'd always be able to refer to it, but I didn't necessarily need to make a change to my emergency preparedness plan each time that the policy was updated. And if you didn't document it, it just did not happen. And I'm sure everybody in the room has heard that, because if every provider knows that that verbiage. But regardless of what type of activity, you do document everything. You know, I said the key card comment, like I don't want to embarrass myself that we locked the keys in the room, but you would write that down. That is a pretty big, important event that you have potentially locked everything in a room and delayed your med pass time. Something easily avoidable next time. You know, I don't think we ever let that nurse forget that she locked all the keys in the room, but we would really want to write it down just to make sure that we were prepared next time. In terms of what will qualify, you would just write down what the actual event that you did was, whether that's community-based, facility-based, or tabletop, what families or guardians took place, what individuals took place, what employees took place, and anybody from the community that took place. You know, really the more the merrier. Everybody has a different perspective on what should happen and what that looks like, the timeliness of all that. All their opinions weigh into your emergency plan. What time of day did it take place? And you should always vary your shifts. You know, if I were ideally going to run a fire drill, I'm always shooting for first shift where all my staff are awake. Everybody in my program was a lot of non-ambulatory people, so I would prefer them to be in their wheelchairs before we would evacuate. You know, pivots and Hoyer lifts become cumbersome when you're trying to evacuate. So you should vary your shift, right? It's always most difficult to evacuate on a third shift because you have less staff, people are asleep, and less likely to be able to want to move. You should be targeting all 3 shifts to make sure that you're capable of meeting those minimum standards across the board. Document everything you learned, revise your plan as needed, and then your name, signature, and the date is a standard for any revision. Do you have anything you want to add there, Deb? Does anybody have any questions about all that or any life experiences?
How many of you had to go through an evacuation? A couple of them. Not very many. I'm actually surprised. It's not been more than that. So.
I know we have some people online, but we, you know, in the room, we have some people that have actually prepared for emergencies and evacuated. I'm sure everybody's used to fire drills. Anybody from a provider. That's why I use that example. Something else I think is interesting is you could just build this in just like a fire drill schedule. That was what we did eventually. We just built it in. So every month we had a new emergency that we would evacuate. So if there's a power outage was one month, stranger danger was another one, things of that nature. We just built it in. So every month we had a new drill. Every month we would do something different. We would document what we learned. It did create 12 revisions a year. But at the end of the day, we really felt like we were prepared for anything that got thrown our way. Eventually, we did have to evacuate or lock down specific homes for somebody being on campus that wasn't expected. The staff knew exactly what to do because we've already been practicing this. Most facilities, when you're doing your fire drills all the time, a new staff, you can always tell who's new because they're not used to the drill. You know, then once you get used to it, you do it every month. You have a plan in place. You kind of know these things are going to be happening every month. You're doing it 12 times a year at minimum. Then you're kind of ready for everything. It's just when you don't practice frequently that, you know, these emergencies sneak up on you, and then you're kind of out of luck, or you're scrambling more than you should have to. And then when it's a real event, that's the last thing you want to do is be looking for the emergency preparedness bag that you're supposed to be bringing with you because you haven't used it for 6 months, or somebody went in and took the first aid kit. I know there was always, in my program, I don't know why, the syrup of Ipecac was always missing. Every time we went into that thing to look for the syrup's gone. I don't know what anybody does with the syrup of Ipecac. That's why I was an administrator. I always traveled with my DON, and she would tell me, like any good administrator, what to do. But you want to make sure that you're always ready. Those things are always in there. The other thing that we did was we would actually audit those things. So I was in an ICF, and ICFs are regulatory heavy. Every month we would do a physical plant review. We added the emergency preparedness materials to that physical plant review so that when that syrup of Ipecac was looked for, it was actually in the box, or your Band-Aids or whatever else you'd be mobilizing with. Those monthly checks really help, you know, keep the staff, the management, and everybody else all on the same page. And like Deb said, we're right around the corner. We're in the warm hall. So if anybody wants to come on over and get warm, I'm more than welcome to come over and can answer any specific questions that you have, but we greatly appreciate your time.
So Deb and AJ, So since we have a lot of county boards, they're not providers, but they are have schools. So the recommendations with them and schools and medications.
Yeah, sure. The schools are really the same thing. They're held to the same standard. Um, you would be able to do something similar for any school, do a facility-based risk assessment. You know, they're regularly available online. Um, but they also have their own requirements. You know, like an earthquake isn't always required in Ohio or Pennsylvania, where we had a 2.2 earthquake like 6 months ago. That wouldn't qualify as our top 10. But things like earthquakes are something that every school does. Active shooter drills are now something that gets added to every school, even though it might not be likely in your community-based risk assessment. So if I were going to make a suggestion, it would be do the risk assessment, find out where your top 10 are, build them into your monthly and annual drills, and then make sure that the students, families, caregivers, anybody that comes in that building is all aware of the plan and tested on the plan at least annually, if not monthly.
And I would just like to add, in addition to that, I think it's always easy for us to think about something, but then when it actually happens, it's a whole different story. So people really preparing, and I mean, I remember back early on, we had a piece of a red blanket cut out like a fire that we would set out and see how long it took for somebody to see that fire. And that was our fire drill. We did that at one point with that. But it's like you knew it wasn't a real fire. So I don't think people respond to it the same. And just be mindful of that from that standpoint, that, try to make it as realistic as possible, and for people to really understand that you may think this isn't a big deal, but when it really happens, you're going to be a whole different mindset with that. So trying to make things as realistic as possible, is going to be your best medicine from that standpoint.